Chapter 8 is all about index models, more specifically, single-factor models. Single-factor models allow us to decompose risk into firm-specific and systematic. We're going to compare this model to the Markowitz procedure from the previous chapter. If you'll recall, in the Markowitz procedure, we had a covariance-variance matrix, which meant that we had an enormous number of calculations to do, an enormous number of inputs into generating the optimal portfolio. So we're going to see that the single index model greatly simplifies this process. So if we take our model where R sub I, the returns on asset sub I, is equal to your expected return of asset sub I plus some sensitivity of asset sub I, which is beta, to an overall common macroeconomic factor, M, plus some firm-specific component of asset I. So in other words, the actual return in your asset is your expected return of your asset plus the sensitivity of that asset to some common macroeconomic factor plus a firm-specific surprise associated with that asset. This gives us effectively a regression equation. So if you say the return on sub I is equal to alpha sub I plus beta sub I, which is that sensitivity of your asset I, to the returns on the overall marketplace, and this t implication is just that this is at period time sub t, and some firm-specific surprise associated with asset I. So this is the actual return is alpha plus beta times the return on the market plus a firm-specific component or an error component. So if you take the error component out, the entire equation would be in expectations, which is what we have here. The expectations of return on asset I is the alpha of asset I plus beta, some sensitivity of I, to the expected return on your marketplace. Okay? Making sense, I hope. Next, let's look at the variance component. The variance of asset sub I is the sensitivity of I times the variance of the marketplace. So we have asset sub I, variance of asset sub I is equal to beta squared sub I times the variance of the marketplace sub I, the overall marketplace, and the variance of some firm-specific component of I. Therefore, the covariance is simply going to be the product of the betas. So if you have asset I and asset J, the covariance between the two is your betas times the variance of the marketplace. So it's easy to see here that as you add more assets to your portfolios, where N is the number of assets, you have the variance of your portfolio, which is the sum of N as N runs from 1 through the number that you have, the average of that times the variance of the asset. You can see here that as N gets bigger, this is an average variance of your assets, as N gets bigger, variance becomes negligible and firm-specific risk is diversified away. So, effectively, this becomes a regression equation. We have the returns of HP in this particular example, which is in your textbook. So, the returns of HP, let me bring up my drawing tools. The returns of HP per period time t is equal to the alpha of HP plus the beta of HP times the return on the marketplace, in this case, the S&P 500 at period t, plus some firm-specific component at period T for the asset HP. You can imagine that running a regression equation, when you have your excess returns on the asset and the excess return on the market, will provide you with an estimate of this sensitivity of HP to the overall marketplace. You can imagine that this is much easier than the Markowitz procedure, which we discussed in the previous chapter. Okay, thank you.